My accountant called on a Thursday afternoon. Said he had been going through the financial disclosure documents. Said he wanted to talk about some numbers before I signed anything. His tone was careful in the specific way of someone who has found something and is deciding how to say it. I asked him what he had found. He said the declared assets didn't match what he would have expected, that certain numbers were off in a way he wanted to look at more closely before he could say anything definitive. I asked him what more closely meant. He said he wanted to bring in someone with a specific skill set, a forensic accountant, someone who examined financial records in the context of legal proceedings, who knew what deliberate concealment looked like when it was designed not to be found. I sat with that for a moment. My wife had said she wanted a clean divorce, had said it from the beginning, had presented herself throughout as someone who wanted to handle things fairly and move forward without conflict. I had believed her. I had wanted to believe her. I told my accountant to bring in whoever he needed and to tell me what they found. What they found took 3 weeks to document fully and change the settlement entirely. But to understand what that report revealed, you need to know what a clean divorce had looked like on the surface. The marriage had lasted 10 years, not a failed decade, a real one, with a full texture of 2 people who chose each other genuinely and built a shared life that contained real things. A home, friends who belonged to both of us. The particular accumulated history of 10 years of ordinary and significant moments that make 2 lives genuinely intertwined. I want to say that clearly before anything else, because this story is not the story of a marriage that was always wrong. It is the story of a marriage that had been real and that ended, and of what emerged during the ending that changed how I understood certain things about the preceding years. We met in our late 20s. Both of us established enough to know what we wanted. Young enough that what we wanted still had the quality of something being discovered rather than something confirmed by experience. She was smart, the specific kind of intelligence that expresses itself through perception rather than performance. She noticed things, understood situations quickly, saw the dynamics in rooms and relationships that other people took longer to read. That quality had attracted me from the beginning, and it was the quality I thought about most in the weeks after my accountant called, because the same perceptiveness that had made her someone I wanted to be with had apparently been applied to something I hadn't been paying attention to. The marriage worked for most of its duration. Not perfectly. No marriage is perfect, but genuinely, with the specific qualities that make a long relationship worth having. Mutual respect, shared interest in building something together, the ability to navigate difficulty without it becoming the defining feature. The financial picture of the marriage was comfortable. Both of us worked. Both of us earned well. Neither of us had come into the marriage with significant individual wealth. What existed had been built jointly. Or so I had understood. The business she ran had started small. A consultancy in her field that she had built from modest beginnings across the middle years of the marriage. It had grown, not dramatically, but consistently, into something with real revenue and real clients and a position in its market that reflected years of genuine work. I had supported that growth, not financially primarily, in the ways that matter in a marriage. The practical flexibility that allowed her to invest fully in building it. The adjustments to our shared life that made space for the demands of building a business. The specific daily support of someone who wanted the person they were with to succeed and organized accordingly. I had been proud of what she built, had spoken about it with genuine appreciation, had understood it as one of the real achievements of our shared life. The divorce conversation began in the spring, not dramatically, in the particular way that endings begin when they are not about a single event, but about a drift that has become undeniable. 2 people who had grown in different directions over the preceding few years, whose lives had become less shared and more parallel, whose attempts to close the distance had produced less each time until both of them understood that closing it was no longer possible. She said she wanted it to be clean, used that word specifically, said there was no reason for it to be adversarial. that we were adults who had built something together and who could dismantle it with the same maturity. I agreed, believed it, found a lawyer, began the process, and entered the financial disclosure phase with a genuine expectation that what I received from the process would be an accurate account of what existed, that the clean divorce she had described was what I would get. The expectation was wrong, but I didn't know that yet. I only knew it when my accountant called on a Thursday afternoon and said the numbers didn't match. The forensic accountant's name was Ms. Brennan. She came recommended by my accountant as someone who had worked on financial disclosure cases for over 15 years, who understood the specific ways that assets get obscured in divorce proceedings, who knew what deliberate concealment looked like when it had been carefully constructed to look like ordinary financial complexity. I met her once before she began the work. She asked me to describe the financial picture of the marriage as I understood it, the assets I was aware of, the income streams I knew about, the business and what I knew of its financial position, the accounts I'd shared access to, the accounts I knew existed in her name alone. I told her everything I could account for. She listened carefully, made notes, asked specific questions about the business, when it had started generating significant revenue, what the billing structure had been, whether I had ever been involved in the financial management of it, whether I had ever reviewed its accounts. I told her I hadn't been involved in the financial management, that the business was hers, that I had trusted her accounting of it, that I had no reason to look at it in the way she was suggesting it needed to be looked at. She nodded, said she would need access to the disclosed documents and to whatever additional records could be obtained through the legal process. She said she would come back to me when she had something specific to say, that she would not speculate before then. I appreciated the precision of that, the commitment to findings rather than theories. I gave her access to everything I had and waited. The waiting period was 3 weeks. 3 weeks of going about ordinary life while something significant was being assembled in the background. I want to work, maintain the surface of a functioning existence. Try not to construct possibilities in the absence of findings. Try to hold the uncertainty without filling it. It was not easy because my accountant's call had introduced a suspicion that could not be fully set aside. The suggestion that the clean divorce she had offered might not be what it presented itself as. That the 10 years of marriage might contain a financial reality I had not been party to. That the person I had built a shared life with had been managing something alongside that life that I knew nothing about. Those thoughts existed. I tried not to let them run ahead of the evidence. Not always successfully. Ms. Brennan came back to me at the end of the 3rd week. She asked to meet in person, which told me something before she said anything. Findings that are simple are delivered by phone or email. Findings that require careful presentation require a room. She had a room. I sat across from her. She had prepared a document. Not long, precise. The specific language of a professional who has found something and is presenting it accurately. She walked me through it. The income that had been declared from a business was significantly lower than what the business appeared to have generated. Revenue that had moved through the business accounts had been redirected before declaration. Not all of it. Enough. Through a structure that had been constructed carefully enough to survive a surface examination, but not carefully enough to survive the specific scrutiny of someone who did this professionally. There were accounts I had not known existed, in her name, opened across the preceding 3 years, into which money had been systematically moved in amounts calibrated to avoid triggering automated alerts. The specific methodology of someone who understood financial systems, who had planned this, not in response to the divorce. Before the divorce, I asked Ms. Brennan when the first account had been opened. She told me, approximately 3 years before the divorce conversation. I sat with that. 3 years, while we were still married, while the marriage had appeared to be functioning normally, while I had been supporting the growth of the business with the flexibility I had provided. The money being moved into those accounts had been accumulating across the same period. I had been a present and contributing partner in the marriage. Ms. Brennan said the total picture was substantially different from the declared assets, that the settlement I would have received based on the declared numbers was significantly less than what accurate disclosure would produce. She placed a figure on the table, the difference between what she had been declared and what the forensic review had found. I looked at it. Then I looked at Ms. Brennan and asked her what came next. My lawyer's name was Mr. Hassan. He had been handling the divorce from the beginning. A family law specialist with enough experience that his manner had the particular quality of someone who has seen most versions of how these proceedings go, who is neither surprised by difficulty nor falsely reassured by surface civility. I called him the afternoon I met with Ms. Brennan, told him what the forensic review had found. He was quiet for a moment after I finished. Then he asked how confident Ms. Brennan was in her findings. I told him her confidence was complete, that the document she had prepared was specific and evidenced, that she had not presented theories. She had presented findings. He said to bring everything to his office the following morning. I went in with Ms. Brennan's report and the supporting documentation she had prepared. Mr. Hassan read through it carefully, took his time, the specific, focused reading of someone who is assessing not just content, but legal utility. What to be used, how it could be presented, what it changes about the proceedings. When he finished, he said something that recalibrated how I was thinking about everything. He said the findings changed the character of the proceedings entirely, that what had been a relatively straightforward financial settlement was now a case involving deliberate concealment of assets, that the court took that seriously, not as a civil disagreement about valuation, as a substantive failure of the disclosure obligations that family proceedings legally required, that the findings needed to be formally introduced into the proceedings, that once they were introduced, the burden shifted significantly. Her legal team would need to account for what the forensic review had found, not explain it away with general statements about accounting complexity. Account for it, specifically, with the same specificity that Ms. Brennan had brought to finding it. He asked whether I was prepared for the proceedings to become more adversarial than they had been, that introducing the forensic findings would change the tone, that the clean divorce she had presented would not survive the confrontation with the evidence, that her legal team would respond defensively, that the process would become harder before it became resolved. I told him I was prepared, that the version of the clean divorce I had been offered had turned out not to be what it presented itself as, and that accepting a settlement based on deliberately false disclosure was not something I was willing to do regardless of how uncomfortable the alternative became. He nodded, said he would proceed. The formal introduction of Ms. Brennan's findings into the proceedings happened through the correct legal mechanism, a disclosure application, requesting that the court consider the forensic review's findings as evidence of non-disclosure, and requiring a complete and accurate restatement of the financial picture. Her legal team's response arrived about 10 days later. Mr. Hassan briefed me on its content. It attempted to address the findings through the framing of accounting complexity, that the movement of funds had been legitimate business management, that the accounts Ms. Brennan had identified were operational rather than concealment vehicles, that the valuation differences were the result of different accounting methodologies rather than deliberate understatement. Mr. Hassan said the response was professionally constructed, that it addressed each element of the findings with an explanation, but that the explanations had a quality he wanted me to understand. They were plausible individually. In isolation, each one could be read as a legitimate account of an ordinary financial decision. But the cumulative picture they produced when set against Ms. Brennan's findings was not plausible, because the explanations required too many coincidences, too many independently legitimate decisions that all happened to move money in the same direction, away from the declared picture, over 3 years, in amounts that stayed below alert thresholds. That pattern did not describe accounting complexity. It described accounting management, directed toward a specific outcome. Ms. Brennan prepared a response to the explanations, not a rebuttal that was aggressive in tone, a precise document that took each explanation offered and placed it against the evidence, showing specifically where the explanation held and where it did not, where the movement of funds was consistent with normal business operations, and where it was not. The places where it was not were the significant ones, and they were numerous enough that the cumulative picture survived the attempt to explain it away. I want to describe what the period of this process felt like honestly, because it was not comfortable, not just legally. Personally, I was processing simultaneously the legal situation and the human reality it described. 3 years of something running alongside my marriage that I had been entirely unaware of. The specific quality of discovering that a period of your life you believed you understood had a dimension you had no access to. That the person you shared a life with had been managing something that required your ignorance to function. That is a specific kind of difficult, separate from the legal process, separate from the financial stakes, the quiet personal reckoning with what the 3 years had actually contained. I went through it without letting it consume the process. The process needed clear thinking, and clear thinking required keeping the personal dimension in its own compartment, not suppressed, separate, available to be processed, but not allowed to drive decisions that needed to be driven by evidence. The case went before the judge at a preliminary hearing, not the full settlement hearing, a procedural stage at which the court considered the disclosure application and the evidence supporting it. Mr. Hassan had prepared thoroughly. Ms. Brennan's report was submitted in full. The supporting documentation attached. The response from her legal team submitted alongside. Ms. Brennan's rebuttal of that response included the full picture laid before the court for initial assessment. I want to describe what that hearing felt like from my side, because hearings in these proceedings are not dramatic in the way that courtroom scenes in films are dramatic. They are procedural, formal, conducted in the specific language of legal proceedings that has its own rhythm and its own logic. But underneath the formality, something significant was happening. A judge was reading the evidence, assessing the findings, forming a view about the credibility of what had been presented on both sides. And the findings were clear enough that the view being formed was not ambiguous. The judge asked questions directed at both legal teams. Specific questions about the accounts Ms. Brennan had identified, about the timing of their opening, about the movement of funds and the business rationale for the structures involved. Her legal team provided the answers they had prepared, the same explanations that the written response had contained, delivered now orally in the context of a judge who had read the forensic report and the rebuttal and was assessing their credibility in real time. Mr. Hassan told me afterward what he had observed in the hearing, that the judge's demeanor during the explanations had a quality he recognized, the specific quality of someone who is being given an account they have already decided is insufficient, who is asking questions not because the answers might change their view, but because the process requires the answers to be on the record, before the finding that was already forming receives its formal expression. The preliminary finding directed a complete and accurate restatement of the financial disclosure, under supervision, with Ms. Brennan engaged to review the restated figures before submission. The direction was not the settlement. It was the instruction to produce the accurate picture that the original disclosure had not provided. That instruction carried a specific weight, because it was the court saying clearly that the original disclosure was not accepted, that the explanations offered had not satisfied the standard required, that what was needed was not a revised version of the same framing, an accurate account, produced with the understanding that it would be reviewed by someone who had already demonstrated the ability to find what had been hidden. Her legal team asked for time, a reasonable period to compile the restated figures. The court granted it, with a specific deadline, non-negotiable, and the instruction that the restatement should be complete, not another version of the original. Complete. I left that hearing with Mr. Hassan. We walked to his office. He sat down and gave me his assessment. He said the direction was as strong as it could have been at this stage, that the court had communicated clearly. without issuing a formal finding of non-disclosure yet. It had made its view of the original disclosure evident, and had created the conditions under which the accurate picture would either be produced voluntarily or produced through compulsion. Either way, it would be produced. He said the restatement process was the critical next stage, that it would reveal whether her legal team had advised her to produce a genuinely accurate account, or whether there would be further attempts to manage the picture. He said he hoped it was the former, that the simplest and cleanest path forward was a complete and honest restatement that produced a settlement based on what actually existed. I told him I hoped the same, not for any sentimental reason, because the longer the process took, the more it cost everyone, in time, in money, in the specific emotional drain of sustained legal adversarialism with someone who had been your partner for 10 years. The restatement period ran for 3 weeks. Ms. Brennan was available throughout to respond to questions and to review materials as they emerged. Her involvement was the specific pressure that made a further attempt to manage the picture inadvisable, because she had already demonstrated what she could find, and her presence in the process made clear that what was submitted would be reviewed by someone who would find again whatever was hidden again. The restated disclosure arrived on a Friday morning. Mr. Hassan and Ms. Brennan reviewed it together. The picture it produced was significantly different from the original. The restated disclosure was not complete honesty. I want to be accurate about that. It was more honest than the original, significantly more. The accounts Ms. Brennan had identified were now included. The business revenue figures had been revised upward. The asset valuations had been restated in ways that brought them closer to their actual position. The picture that emerged was materially different from what I would have settled on the basis of the original disclosure. But Ms. Brennan reviewed the restatement with the same methodical precision she had brought to the original documents. And her assessment was that the restatement was an improvement that did not represent a full accounting, that certain elements remained understated, that the movement of funds through the business accounts was still not fully reconciled, that some of the asset valuations, while improved, remained below the figures her analysis had produced. She documented the remaining discrepancies, specifically, with the same evidence-based precision that had characterized everything she had produced. Not speculation about what might still be hidden. Specific identifiable gaps between the restated figures and what the evidence supported. Mr. Hassan submitted that assessment to the court alongside the restated disclosure. The submission was direct. The restatement represented a partial improvement. It did not represent the complete and accurate picture the court's direction had required. The remaining discrepancies were documented. The evidence supporting those discrepancies was attached. The court was asked to consider the settlement on the basis of the figures Ms. Brennan's analysis had produced, rather than the figures the restatement had provided, on the grounds that the restatement remained incomplete. The response from her legal team was different in tone from the earlier responses. Not the confident challenge of a team that believed its position was defensible. Something more measured, more careful. The particular quality of a legal team that has assessed the situation and understands that the ground it is standing on is not solid. They requested a meeting between the legal teams, without clients present, to discuss the path to resolution. Mr. Hassan agreed, briefed me on the meeting afterward. He said the conversation had been substantive, that the other team had acknowledged the discrepancies in the restatement, had indicated that a further revised figure was possible, had asked what number would allow the matter to resolve. Mr. Hassan had given them the number, Ms. Brennan's number, the figure produced by the forensic analysis, not a negotiating position, the accurate figure, the number that reflected what the marriage had actually produced in terms of joint assets, what I was genuinely entitled to on an accurate accounting, not inflated by the process, not discounted by the concealment, just accurate. He said the meeting had not produced an immediate agreement, but that the tone had changed enough to suggest one was coming, that the choice facing her legal team was between producing a third version of the disclosure that still would not satisfy Ms. Brennan, and therefore returning to court with the original discrepancy still on the record, or accepting the figure and resolving the matter. Mr. Hassan said the second option was the one a well-advised party in that position would take, because the first option was not a viable strategy. It was a delay, and delays in these circumstances cost money and produce findings that tend not to improve with repetition. The full settlement hearing was scheduled regardless, because the process required it, and because having it scheduled was itself a form of pressure. A fixed date on which the matter would be resolved one way or another, either through an agreed settlement produced before that date, or through the court's determination of the settlement based on everything that was in the record. Everything in the record told a specific story, about an original disclosure that had not been accurate, about a forensic review that had found what the disclosure had not revealed, about a restatement that had partially corrected the picture but not completely, about the gap between what had been declared and what the evidence supported. The judge who would hear the full hearing had read all of it, and Mr. Hassan's assessment of how that judge was likely to approach a settlement determination in the context of that record was not an assessment that favored the other side. The agreement came 4 days before the scheduled hearing. Her legal team communicated that their client was prepared to accept the figure, Ms. Brennan's figure, the accurate one. Mr. Hassan confirmed it, asked me whether I was prepared to settle on those terms. I said yes, not with triumph, with the particular relief of something that had been running for months arriving at its correct conclusion. The documentation was prepared, the settlement formalized, both parties signed, and the proceedings concluded. The settlement was signed on a Wednesday morning. I received confirmation from Mr. Hassan by midday. Read it, thanked him for his work, put the phone down, and sat in my office for a while, not celebrating, not in the particular state of relief I had expected, just sitting with the completion of something that had consumed a significant portion of the preceding months. The feeling was quieter than I had anticipated, more complex, because the financial outcome was correct. I had received what the marriage had genuinely produced, what I was honestly entitled to on an accurate accounting of 10 years of shared life. That was right, and it was the result of doing the right things in the right order. My accountant noticing something, Ms. Brennan being brought in, Mr. Hassan presenting the findings correctly, the process producing the outcome the evidence warranted. All of that was right, and underneath all of that was something else, something that the correct outcome did not resolve and had never been going to resolve. The human reality of what the forensic review had revealed, not the legal finding, the personal one. 3 years. The accounts had been opened 3 years before the divorce conversation, which meant that at some point during the marriage, while I was present and invested in organizing my life around what I understood us to be building together, she had been building something else, quietly, in parallel, with the specific patience of someone who had decided what they needed and was managing the conditions to produce it. I don't know exactly when the decision was made, whether it was a single moment of calculation or a gradual drift into something that started small and became systematic, whether the marriage had already ended for her before the accounts were opened, or whether the accounts were a preparation for an ending she was still deciding whether to pursue. I don't know, and I made peace with not knowing, because the answer wouldn't have changed anything that mattered. The facts are the facts regardless of the timeline of her internal decisions. What I thought I understood about the preceding 3 years had been incomplete. What I had believed about the clean divorce I was being offered had been wrong, and the process had corrected both of those things. I thought about the word clean, the word she had used when the divorce conversation began. I had taken it to mean honest, uncomplicated, free of the particular adversarialism that makes some of these proceedings so damaging to everyone involved. What it had actually described was a version of the outcome that was clean for her, that resolved the marriage on numbers she had spent 3 years preparing, that produced a settlement based on a picture she had constructed rather than the one that actually existed. Clean in the sense of managed, not clean in the sense of honest. The distinction cost her significantly more than the alternative would have, because an honest settlement on accurate figures would have been uncomfortable but manageable. What the process produced was the accurate figures anyway, plus the court record, plus the documented history of what had happened and how the proceedings had required it to be corrected, plus the specific professional and personal consequences of that record existing. None of those additional costs have been necessary. They existed because of the attempt to manage the outcome, and because my accountant had looked carefully enough at the numbers to make a phone call on a Thursday afternoon. I called him the day after the settlement was signed. Thanked him. He said he was glad it had resolved correctly, that when he had seen the figures, he had been uncertain whether to say anything, that it had seemed like a significant thing to raise in the context of a divorce that both parties had described as civil, that he had decided the uncertainty was not enough reason not to say something. I told him the decision to say something had made the difference between a settlement that was accurate and one that was not, that I was grateful he had trusted his reading of the numbers. He said it was what the job was for. I called Ms. Brennan as well. She was professional about it, said the case had been well supported by the documentation, that my accountant's instinct had been correct and that the evidence had been there to find, that cases like this one were not unusual in her experience, that the particular approach she had found was one she had seen in variations before, that people who conceal assets in divorce proceedings tend to use similar methodologies because the same gaps in standard disclosure exist across cases, and that forensic review exists precisely to close those gaps. I asked her whether she thought the concealment had been planned from the beginning of the marriage. She said she could not say from the financial evidence alone, that the accounts had been opened 3 years before the divorce, that the movement of funds appeared to have been systematic and deliberate, but that the decision-making behind it was not something financial documents could fully reveal. I thanked her. Let go. The question of when and why was one I could spend significant energy on without arriving at an answer that served any useful purpose. What I had was the correct settlement, the accurate accounting, the financial foundation for the next chapter built on what actually existed rather than on what I had been offered. That was enough. I moved forward, not quickly. 10 years of shared life does not conclude cleanly regardless of how the legal proceedings go. There is the practical unwinding, the division of the physical world that had accumulated across a decade, the address change, the accounts separated, the particular process of becoming a single unit after a long period of being half of something larger. All of that took time and required a specific kind of attention, methodical, without letting the practical demands become occasions for grief or anger or the reopening of things that needed to stay closed. I also thought carefully about what I had learned, not just about the marriage or about her, about myself, about the specific ways that trust can produce vulnerability that is invisible until something reveals it. I had trusted completely, not naively, with a genuine trust of someone who had no reason visible to him not to trust. And that trust had been taken advantage of, not in a way that made trust wrong, in a way that made careful attention right. The lesson was not to trust less. It was to remain attentive even within trust, to not allow trust to become a reason to stop noticing, to stay connected to the details of shared life in a way that trust sometimes causes you to believe is unnecessary. My accountant had stayed attentive, had looked carefully even when the surface looked clean, had trusted his reading of the numbers rather than the presentation of the situation. That attentiveness had protected me in a way my own trust had not. I wanted to carry that forward, as a quality rather than as suspicion. The difference between the two is significant. Suspicion assumes the worst and looks for confirmation. Attentiveness simply pays attention, without assumption, without conclusion drawn before the evidence is examined. Just the steady practice of someone who understands that the accurate picture is always worth looking for, regardless of what the surface suggests. Trust is not the problem. Stopping paying attention because you trust someone is the problem. The two things are not the same. If this story resonated with you, the importance of the numbers, the value of someone who looks carefully when it matters, leave it in the comments. I read every one, and the next story is already waiting for you.